watching that. Okay, everyone, welcome to this session with Mike Rezendes, who's part of the Spotlight investigative team of the Boston Globe, who we just saw there being played by Mark Ruffalo. Now, I think there was a time when war reporters used to be the glamour boys and girls of the world of journalism. Now I think it's investigative reporters. And one of the reasons for that, obviously, is because of Spotlight. I think Spotlight did to investigative journalism what Top Gun did for the US Air Force. I mean, just imagine this. 1 minute, you're a reporter, toiling away in some dingy room, staring at balance sheets or something equally nerdy. And then you look up, and you see that someone like you is being played by Mark Ruffalo. I mean, Mark Ruffalo plays the Hulk. He's a bona fide Avenger, for God's sake. So I think a result of Spotlight, two things happened. One is, in newsrooms around the world, the call went out, where is our goddamn Spotlight story? Where's our big story? And the other thing, of course, is I think in every book festival, in every seminar, in every big think fest, the call went out, let's get those Spotlight guys on board. And I assume, Mike, that since the film came out, that's what it's been like, right? Have you been in much demand?
Yes, I've been in demand all over the world, and so have my colleagues on the Spotlight team, and we're very happy about that because we really, truly believe that investigative reporting is essential to our democracies. Investigative reporting is essential to freedom because without the information, without the facts that investigative reporting provides, it's really impossible for people to make the decisions that they need to make in a democracy. So we're very happy to be spreading the word about the importance of investigative reporting.
And is it true, the rumors I heard, that you're going to play Hulk in the next movie? And Mark Ruffalo is going to be doing a little bit of, balance sheet scanning.
Well, I didn't mean to say this, but I am the Hulk, in fact.
But, let's just, for a minute before we move forward, let's just, for the benefit of those who've either not seen the film or who've not been conversant with the story, the investigation into child sex abuse by the church, and even if they have, relive some of that. Because it is an inspirational story for not just people like us as journalists, but even for people at large. Taking us back to the time when you first sensed that here was this huge scandal that was simply not something that anybody was willing to talk about.
Well, this experience uncovering the cover-up of child sex abuse in the Catholic Church was like experiencing a series of big revelations, a series of earthquakes. It's been said that the cover-up is worse than the crime, and as horrible as child sexual abuse is, I think that's true in this case. The thing that blew everybody's mind was that the highest church officials in the Boston Archdiocese, including the senior Catholic official in the United States, was fully aware of the extent of the child sex abuse within the church and nevertheless allowed it to continue happening. Our investigation started with one priest, one. There was a priest who sexually molested more than 150 children over 30 years in 6 different parishes. And the discovery we made, and the proof that we obtained, showed that Cardinal Bernard Law, the #1 Catholic in the United States of America, Cardinal Bernard Law knew that this abuse was happening and allowed it to continue. His predecessor, Cardinal Medeiros, also knew about the abuses committed by the same priest and allowed it to continue. Now, we had no idea at that time that there were several other priests like this particular priest whose name was John Gagan in the Boston Archdiocese. We came to believe that there might be as many as a half a dozen serial child abusers in the Boston Archdiocese. And we thought that would be an incredible story. But now we know that there were more than 250 priests who were credibly accused of sexually abusing children in the Boston Archdiocese alone. At the end of nearly a year and a half of reporting, we had counted up about 150. Now it's 250 just in the Boston Archdiocese. And you know, I think it's pretty obvious now that there's nothing strange about the drinking water in Boston. This is not a problem that is particular to Boston. The scandal of the cover-up of child sex abuse by priests, of course, spread all over America. And I went to New York City and revealed a similar cover-up. And I went to a place called Tucson, Arizona in the American West and revealed another cover-up. So we started to get the sense that maybe this was happening all over America. And now we know that indeed it was. What we didn't expect is that this scandal would spread all over the world. And over the last 16 years since we published our story, that's what happened. The scandal of the cover-up of child sexual abuse continues to unfold all over the world, most recently in Argentina, in France, and in Australia, where the government has set up a special commission to investigate child sexual abuse and has discovered rampant abuse within the Catholic Church in Australia.
This is true. This is the extraordinary thing about the story, that it still has legs. It just keeps going and going. And I think once the film came out and it started to play in different parts of the world, those stories started to come out in those parts of the world as well. But just to look at the germ of how it started and use that as a lesson for journalism, characterize that for us. What triggered or what led you to the story, and what lesson lies therein for journalists?
Well, that's a very good question, because there are some important lessons here. And the first lesson, I think, really is a simple one, but it's something that's simpler said than done, and that's to question authority. That is the job of a journalist, to always question authority. Boston is the most Catholic city in the United States, and of course the Catholic Church presents itself as a paragon of morality. This is an institution that portrays itself as holy and as good. This is an institution that portrays itself as the most holy. The organization that teaches good, that teaches morality. And what we found out is that that was not the case at all. Now, this had been going on for decades. Why did it take us so long to start to question the authority of the Catholic Church? Well, that's because who would question the Catholic Church? This was the center of morality and goodness in our society. Who would question the Catholic Church? Catholic priests, they were next to God. They controlled the political process. They controlled the political establishment. They had great power in the state legislature. They had great power at City Hall. They had great influence. Most of the readers of the Boston Globe were Catholic. So to question the Catholic Church was a real risk. And of course, we failed in our responsibility to question authority for decades. So I think that's the number one lesson. Don't take anyone's word for it. Right. Your job as a journalist is to question authority, question your elected officials, question your government officials, question the military, question the Catholic Church. That's what journalists are supposed to do.
Right. Now, if I can ask, are you Catholic?
I was raised Catholic. My family was pretty devout Catholic. I'm half Portuguese and also French Canadian, and I think both sides of my family were very devout Catholic. I grew up going to Catholic church every Sunday and not eating meat on Friday and observing all of the sacraments. I cannot say that I'm a Catholic today. I am not, but I grew up that way.
But was it hard then to report on something which, in a sense, cut home?
Well, by the time we started our investigation of the Catholic Church, I'd already become skeptical about the Catholic Church for a variety of reasons. And as a matter of fact, and I like to say this, the Spotlight team did not discover clergy sexual abuse, and there had been scandals about priests who molested children in several parts of the United States before the Spotlight team came along. In fact, there was a big scandal in a city called Fall River, Massachusetts, which is not very far from Boston. So I began to feel that there was something going on. It almost felt like an epidemic to me. So by the time our new editor, on his first day of work at the Boston Globe, suggested we take a look at the Catholic Church, I was pretty ready to do that.
Okay. Now, to my point about how there's this call that has gone around, in newsrooms all over the world, let's do our own spotlights. Let's also break those big stories. I think it's important to put into perspective the kind of effort and time and resources that you need to commit to be able to get those extraordinary, agenda-setting, Pulitzer-winning stories. So as a starting point, you have this team, the Spotlight team is the Boston Globe. It's still there. It's still going strong. How much time do you guys get to do a story?
Well, this is the great luxury of working on the Globe Spotlight team and a lot of other investigative teams. I mean, the Spotlight investigation of the Catholic Church, you see in the film, if you've seen the movie. Have people seen the movie? Oh, that's great. That's tremendous. What you see in the movie is a five-month investigation that's conflated into 2 hours. But we will take up to a year. Up to a year to investigate a story. If we think the story is big enough, we will do that.
So 1 year for one story?
It's possible. It's happened, yes.
Okay. Also, in terms of actually being able to commit resources, there's a conventional wisdom amongst newspaper owners and proprietors that investigative journalism is fantastic for the brand. It wins awards. It gets us high profile, but it doesn't make money. Is that true in your experience, is that true?
I think that's not true, and I think this is really an important message for editors and publishers everywhere to hear. So let me explain it. Investigative reporting, it is expensive. In the Spotlight team, the church investigation, you see that we had 4 reporters working full-time. This movie ends on the morning of our first story. After the first story was published, the story exploded. And we added 4 more reporters to our team, 4 of the best reporters at the Boston Globe. So we had 8 reporters working full-time for nearly a year. We also had some high-priced lawyers who were helping us in our quest to obtain documents from the Catholic Church. Taken together, it probably cost $1 million, and this is in 2002 dollars. Probably took $1 million to complete this investigation. So investigative reporting, it is expensive. However, at the Boston Globe, we're experiencing the financial problems that newspapers all over America and I think all over the world are experiencing.
Sure.
Today, we have half as many reporters overall at the Globe as we did in 2001 when we were investigating the Catholic Church, but we have double the size of the Spotlight team. We now have 8 full-time reporters on the Spotlight team. And part of that is altruistic. Part of that is a result of the leadership of the Boston Globe wanting to do the right thing. But the point I want to make here that is so essential is we're doing it because we've discovered it's good business. We now can tell when we put our stories up online, we know which stories are the most popular stories. We can even tell precisely how many people are reading a particular story. We can tell the average amount of time that someone spends on a story. And we know that when Spotlight goes online at the bostonglobe.com website, it's guaranteed to be the most widely read story on the site. Moreover, we know that people are subscribing to bostonglobe.com because of Spotlight stories and because of the investigative reporting we do. So the short message here is the Spotlight team is making money for the Boston Globe. And I think that readers and viewers and listeners, they really expect news organizations to be a watchdog for the public good. They really expect news organizations to hold public officials accountable. And I think if news organizations do that, they will be rewarded, not just by prizes and the recognition of their peers, but by readers, viewers, and listeners who will open their wallets and take out a subscription.
Wow, okay. I hope all our editors and proprietors, I don't know if any are here, but those who aren't here are watching and listening to this, because this is a very important upending of conventional wisdom, like I said, where the first thing you do, especially these days when news organizations are cutting back, is you start cutting back on investigative stuff, you start cutting back on the longer, deeper forms of reportage. So the fact that there are examples where it not just gets you the glory, but it also gets you money, is very, very important. Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, Mike, not just looking at the big child abuse church scandal investigation, because that's now become almost like the only story associated with Spotlight. But you guys have been, that story is now almost, as you were saying, 15 years old. What have been some of the other big scoops that you've worked on since then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the Spotlight series on the Catholic Church was 15 years ago. And I've done a lot of other investigations since then. I think most recently I put a lot of time into exposing the deficiencies in the mental health care system in the state of Massachusetts. I mean, in the United States, we've really stopped taking care of people with a serious mental illness. And so instead of being in hospitals where they can be cared for, they're out on the street, they're in jail, they're in prisons, and they're being treated often in very barbaric ways. There's a particular state prison in Massachusetts where men with a mental illness are held, and it's a very secretive institution, and in fact, people were dying there as a result of the way they were treated, and there was one 23-year-old young man who was killed by the prison guards who had no understanding of mental health. So I've spent probably most of the last 3 or 4 years writing about the appalling conditions that exist, even in the United States, for people who have a severe mental illness.
Wow, that sounds terrific. Is there a potential movie script there?
There might be another movie about this. You know, I've had a long-standing interest in film. I was so happy to see Mara Naren yesterday here on this stage. She was wonderful. So I'm hoping that we can make another movie about the terrible tragedy of mental illness and the lack of care for people with a mental illness in the United States through another movie. It will probably be years before it happens, if it happens, but I've started to work on this project.
And who's going to be playing you? Tom Cruise, I believe, is it talks?
Who knows? I hope there's some wonderful actors who want to play the very important roles in this project, because it's really the actors that help make these movies come alive and draw big audiences and raise consciousness about very important issues.
Right. I want to zoom out a little bit and look at the times we're in and try to put investigative journalism in the context of that. We are in the times of global strongmen. We are in the time of regimes that have become increasingly hostile to the media. We also are in times when a vast section of the public that consumes the news has also become very skeptical of the media, especially big media like the paper that you work for and like the TV network that I work for. How has that changed, if at all it's changed, the kind of journalism, investigative journalism that you are doing, that the Boston Globe is doing?
Well, this is something else that I think has made investigative reporting, fact-based reporting, more important than ever. You know, there is a lot of fake news out there. There are people who manufacture stories that literally are not true, that have no factual basis, just to disrupt society, just to disrupt the political process. So I think it's very, very important that news organizations that are credible really do their very best to find the truth, to discover the truth, and to tell the truth, and to not be biased, and to not make mistakes, because we've really got to get people in the habit of reading, listening to, and looking at news that is fact-based and that is accurate. So the production of credible news and credible investigative reporting, I think, is more important than ever.
But would you say that, in a sense, and this is almost like a counterfactual, that investigative journalism, or journalism as a whole, has come alive in the era of Trump? You've seen now newspapers, TV networks, and so on snap out of a certain, almost a sense of ennui, where you have this false neutrality approach, or where you have a kind of laid-back approach to reporting on power, have now come alive. And we have some fantastic stories coming out.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, Trump, who's so very, very critical of the news media, I mean, he actually called reporters the enemy of the American people. You know, Donald Trump, who is so critical of the news media, in fact, has revived the news media. He's really inspired investigative reporters all over America to do their very best work. You know, I say that Donald Trump picked a fight with the news media, and he is getting the fight of his life. Great investigative work is being done into the Trump administration, and I think that's terrific. My concern about Trump's rhetoric is really not about the effect of his rhetoric in the United States, where you could argue that it's been beneficial for the media. I think that's true. My concern about Trump is the effect of his rhetoric in other countries. For example, I think when Erdogan, the president of Turkey, or Hun Sen in Cambodia, hears the president of the United States declaring war on the media, then they also feel like it's open season. It's open season, and they can attack their critics in the media with impunity. So all of a sudden, you have a place like Turkey where 80 reporters and academics suddenly find themselves in prison, and 175 news organizations and publishing houses are shut down. You have the same situation, as I said, in Cambodia, where Hun Sen is shutting down news organizations, putting a lot of pressure on reporters. You know, the Cambodia Daily folded recently. It's been around for 30 years, really great newspaper. So I think Trump's anti-media rhetoric is actually having a more pernicious effect overseas.
You know, it's true. That's one of the concerns we have here as well. And it's not just Trump's rhetoric alone, because a lot of these countries were already hostile towards their journalists, towards their press. And part of the reason for that is that we simply don't have, in many countries, strong enough laws to protect the media. I mean, one of the things I think that emboldens the American press is the fact that you can write against Trump, you can call him an idiot, you can call him a racist on air, on television every night, and you are still safe from any kind of punitive action by government. You may still, he may tweet against you, he may talk the trash talk, but you don't actually have real consequences. While in countries like India, for instance, there are real consequences to media houses and journalists who try to stand up and speak. You can have, the government agencies come after you, investigate you, even try to shut you down. So I think that's something which is of great value in the American context, which we don't have enough of in the other parts of the world.
Well, I completely agree with that, and I think that's why President Trump's rhetoric has such a pernicious effect. You know, in the United States, we do have a U.S. Constitution, and the First Amendment to our Constitution guarantees freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And that's where our ability as news reporters to work unmolested by the government really comes from. Other countries, unfortunately, do not have that kind of protection for the news media in their in their constitutions, and so that's why I think when Trump says it's okay to start attacking reporters, it's easier for that to happen in other countries. And unfortunately, we're seeing that happen right now. It's very disturbing. I would prefer to see the President of the United States enforcing the idea that the press should be independent and free and serve the people and not the government.
But is there a concern, though, that Trump could escalate from just rhetoric to perhaps actually action?
Yeah, there is that concern. I think it would, given the structure of our government, given the structure of, given the history of a lot of Supreme Court decisions, I think it would take Donald Trump quite a while before he could really enact measures that could constrain the news media in the United States. It would take quite a bit of effort. Laws would have to be passed. I think through the appointment of conservative judges, which he is implementing, I think over time there might be certain cases, libel cases, that come before the courts that could be decided in a very unfortunate way for the news media. But I think that'll take a while for that to happen.
Okay, well, fingers crossed it doesn't happen. But is there also a concern, Mike, that when you invest in this kind of reporting and you do all this hard work and you come out with these stories, there is increasingly, and we discussed this at a session that we had earlier here as well this morning, the concern that there are still large chunks of the population who will simply not buy into it, only because it's been published by the Boston Globe or by the New York Times or by the CNN, who'll buy the whole line that this is just fake news. And if that is a concern, how do you then break into those constituencies?
It is a concern, very serious concern, because I think the society, at least in the United States, is becoming more and more factionalized, and people read newspapers or listen to radio programs or watch TV programs that tend to confirm the political beliefs that they already had. People really don't seem to read or look at news organizations that presents material that contradicts their beliefs. So it's very important for credible news organizations to do a self-examination and make sure they're not being biased in the way they present news or the way they choose the subjects they are going to investigate. It's more important than ever to not be biased. It's more important than ever to be factual and credible. And, I like to choose stories that are going to have an impact, that are going to change things, that are going to change things for the better. And I think if we choose those subjects, if we choose those topics and we accomplish that purpose, then I think people will come to understand which organizations are really acting on behalf of the public.
Right. Do you have any systems in place at the Globe, for instance, or at Spotlight to have those filters in place?
We don't have a particular system, but it's a matter of being conscious of this, and it's a matter of making sure that everybody understands that we cannot let bias dictate how we write the story and how we choose these topics. We just have to be very, very aware all the time of our mission to serve the public good and not be out there trying to reinforce a political point of view.
Okay, this is more almost like a bit of a professional interest question. What kind of checks and filters does a story at Spotlight go through before it finally makes it out?
Well, I think people would be surprised at how many times a story is read by how many different editors. I mean, I'll write the story, and I have an editor, and we have a great relationship, and we'll kind of toss the story back and forth a little bit, and then we send it to the special projects editor, and he gets his turn, and then it goes to the top editor, and he gets his turn. So there's really, if we know it's going to be a controversial story, it might go to a few other editors as well. So there's usually a minimum of 4 editors who will take a look at a Spotlight story, and then of course we send it to our attorneys. And
right.
we make sure that we're not libeling anyone. We make sure that we can back up every single assertion we're making with a document or with someone in authority going on the record. So we take it very, very seriously. It's a time-consuming process. It can be frustrating for the reporter to have to go through 4 or 5 sets of editing, but I think in the final analysis, we're really happy with the way the stories turn out. And very, very rarely is there any criticism that is valid, that comes after one of our stories, because we are so careful. I mean, our stories are controversial. We're not afraid of controversy at all, but it's very rare that there's a substantive criticism.
Have you guys ever got sued?
Sure, we've been. The Boston Globe has been sued. I don't know, multiple times, and usually the lawsuits don't get very far, but occasionally they do, right. And. It's very expensive to defend yourself from a lawsuit, and this is why I think big media has to survive. I mean, it's kind of fashionable these days to knock big media and to be supportive of the smaller startups that you see springing up on the internet. And I'm a big supporter of the startups that are experimenting with the nonprofit model. I think they're great, but I also think that if a news organization is going to challenge a powerful government entity or a powerful corporation, the news organization has to have the resources to do that. It has to have the resources to pay really good reporters, and it has to have the resources to hire good lawyers, not just to defend the organization if it gets sued, but sometimes we're proactive. Sometimes we file lawsuits to get records. And all of that costs money. So for that reason, I think it's important that big media survive.
Sure. In fact, the Post just came out, and that again speaks to the idea that for good journalism, you need good editors, and you need benign proprietors who are willing to both fund that kind of journalism and also protect you against the heat. Now, let's talk about editors first. At the time when Spotlight, when the investigation came out into church sexual abuse, the editor who'd just come in was Marty Baron, right? Who then went on to, who's now editing the Washington Post. Did his entry make a significant difference to the kind of work you guys were doing?
Yeah, Marty Baron showing up at the Boston Globe was key. I mean, I don't think we would have taken up the investigation of the Catholic Church if Marty Baron had not arrived on the scene. And, I think I was talking a little bit earlier about how Boston is the most Catholic city in America. So it was very, I think, difficult for an institution like the Boston Globe or anyone really in Boston to really ask some very, very pointed and serious questions about the Catholic Church. But Marty Baron was from out of town. Marty Baron was not raised Catholic. Marty Baron is Jewish, but I think the most important aspect of Marty Baron's influence on this is the fact that he was coming from outside Boston, and he was specifically coming from Florida, a part of the United States that has very, very strong open records laws. So Marty came to the Boston Globe, and on his first day of work, just as you see in the movie, he read a story about how there were some lawsuits against Cardinal Law and other top officials of the Boston Archdiocese, but the judge had impounded all the records. None of the records could be seen by the public. And in Florida, this would be very unusual. You know, our system of justice in America is predicated on openness. You know, anyone can go in and review any case. Anyone can go in and review the evidence in any case. That's the only guarantee we have that it's not corrupt and that it's fair. So here we had a situation where the Catholic Church was being sued by victims of a priest by the name of John Gagan, who was the priest we started investigating, the priest who molested more than 150 children over 3 decades, and somehow the court had sealed all the records and no one was challenging that. So Marty just thought that didn't make any sense. It wasn't logical, and it wasn't good journalism to allow that to happen. So I think if Marty hadn't come along and just asked that fundamental question, hey, how does this make any sense, and why don't we do something about it, maybe we never would have conducted our investigation, and you know, things would be a lot different today. So Marty's role was absolutely crucial.
And you played a very crucial role in that story as well, because you're the one who actually went and got those records. And in the film, we see your character literally running with those records and, you know, running into the newsroom. Did you actually run with those documents in your hand?
Well,
Or was it a bit of creative license?
I did get the records that prove there was a cover-up, and that was the key to the whole thing. That, as I said, the Cardinal Law knew that Father John Gagan had spent 30 years molesting children and nevertheless allowed Father Gagan to continue working as a priest. You know, I was a runner in college. I was on the cross-country running team, and it's kind of in my blood, you know, and I do tend to get a little bit excited, as the movie also shows. So I was, Mark Ruffalo spent a lot of time with me, and he just kind of figured it out that when I got my hands on records like that I'd probably want to run back to the office as quickly as possible.
Right. You know, one of the concerns that we have here, in the context of talking about great publishers, great owners, great editors, is that there's been a kind of a reverse of what's happened in America in the aftermath of Trump compared to what's happened here, where it seems that most of the mainstream media in America is pushing back, right? Whether it's print, whether it's television. The outliers would be something like a Fox News, or would be the alt media like Breitbart or like InfoWars and so on. But most of the mainstream media seems to be holding the line. They're speaking truth to power to whatever extent they can. While over here, we've had a reverse scenario where most of the media, most of the mainstream media has buckled in and have become propagandists of power. They're not speaking truth to power. They're speaking power's version of truth. And there are just a few outliers who are trying to hold out and, you know, perhaps could do a much better job, but have still not fallen in line. So I think there is a certain advantage, isn't there, that when you're taking on establishments which are critical of the press and which are hostile to the press, there's strength in numbers. You're not just sailing your own boat.
There is strength in numbers, and I think the media in the United States, with the protection of the First Amendment, has done a pretty good job of continuing to question authority. You know, it makes me very concerned when I visit countries where the media becomes essentially a mouthpiece of the government. That's not the role of the news media. As I said before, I think the fundamental lesson of Spotlight is that the news media has to question authority. This is what we do. And we make authority uncomfortable. We make people in positions of power uncomfortable. And because people in positions of power are human beings, they sometimes take this personal and act in ways that they shouldn't. But it's very, very critical for the news media, especially in a democracy, to continue to question authority, to continue to question government decisions, continue to question decisions that are made by corporations. It's the only thing that ensures the well-being of our society, the well-being of our democracies.
To your knowledge, has the Boston Globe ever faced any kind of pressure from anybody, from the government or any other powerful members of the establishment that you're aware of?
We get pressure. It's a little more subtle than I think what people experience in other countries. You know, people ask me if we were ever threatened by the Catholic Church when we were investigating. And we weren't overtly threatened, but Mitchell Garabedian, who was the attorney you see me working for, I mean, in the movie, I say that the church was trying to get Mitchell Garabedian's license taken away, and they were. You know, Mitchell Garabedian was a sole practitioner. He didn't work for a big law firm. He just worked for himself. And the church kept filing complaints against him with the organization that oversees the licensure of attorneys. And so they were trying to deprive him of his ability to make a living. You also see that it's not quite accurate in the movie. There's some church records that are missing. In the movie, I think for the sake of simplicity, the story is that there were 14 key documents missing. Well, that's not exactly right. You know, there were 84 lawsuits that had been filed against the church by victims of Father John Geoghegan. And these particular records that prove there was a cover-up were filed in 14 of the lawsuits. There were actually, weren't 14 documents, it was a big, thick packet of records. And they were filed in 14 separate lawsuits. And in all 14 cases, those records disappeared. So it's clear that someone sympathetic to the church just cleaned out those records. A lot of people are surprised that that could happen, but in fact, it's very, very easy. This is part of what happens when you have an open society. This is sort of the downside of it. Anyone can go into the court clerk's office, request records, slip it into a briefcase, and walk out. It can be very easily done. A metal detector is not going to find that. So the church, they pushed back. The church did threaten to sue us at one point, but we just didn't take it seriously and just kept doing our work.
Okay, I'm going to slowly start wrapping up now so we have time for questions. Just a couple of last things that I wanted to ask you. One is, if you had any advice for young journalists, either in the audience or watching, 3 tips about how to do fantastic investigative journalism, what would that be?
Well, I think that my tips would be, number one, always remember, as I keep saying, you know, your fundamental job is to question authority. And, you know, my other tips would be to find a place where you can start working right away and just get as much experience as you can. Write as often as you can. If you're working for a radio station or a television station, then produce stories as often as you can. Develop a body of work. Get experience. I mean, this is a profession where you can study it, and there are a lot of excellent journalism schools out there. But I think fundamentally, you become a really good journalist through experience. So my advice to young people is get as much experience as you can, work hard, and never forget what your real mission is.
Okay. The last question is somewhat personal. I also wanted to get a movie made about myself, and I was hoping Brad Pitt would be a good choice, given how similar we look. Is that something you can make happen? Now that you're down with with Hollywood, sorry.
You know, who knows? But, you know, I just want to tell everyone, we were shocked that somebody wanted to make a movie about our work. I mean, our stories were published in 2002. It wasn't until 2008 where 2 very young, inexperienced producers approached us about this idea. And then it wasn't until 2015 that the movie came out. We were surprised when we were approached. I mean, I remember I had a conversation where I said to the guy who first had this idea, I said, how can this be a good movie if all the big moments happen when I'm sitting at my desk reading documents? It just didn't seem very sympathetic. I mean, cinematic. But boy, you know, I guess I was wrong about that.
No, they did a great job. Yeah. And you found out that Mark Ruffalo was playing you when?
I found out Mark Ruffalo wanted to make this movie, which I think is really a big reason that it happened. I guess it was, I don't know, maybe a year before they started filming.
Right.
Mark called me one day and said, I want to make this movie, and I want to play you, and I want to meet you, and I want to hang out. And I said, well, fine. But it was really, you know,
as one does.
As you know, what happened is Tom McCarthy and Josh Singer wrote a great script. That's the first thing that happened. And when I read their script, it was the first time I thought, well, maybe this movie is going to happen. And then the script kicked around. I think the subject was obviously very, very controversial. I mean, people found it hard to believe that folks wanted to see a movie about child sexual abuse.
Sure.
Confronting the Catholic Church was a big deal. But once Mark Ruffalo decided he wanted to make it, things started to roll, things started to happen.
One thing I wanted to ask you before we go to questions is that, the life of an investigative journalist is often in the shadows. Anonymity is a key factor, but you guys have lost that now. Is that a professional hazard, or is there a counter? It opens doors.
Well, it's interesting because previously we always tried to keep our work kind of secret until we were just about to publish, and we always did kind of operate in the shadows, as you say. But now our cover is blown and my cover is blown. But I think there's a real super beneficial effect, which is I get a lot more tips than I used to. In fact, I'm deluged with tips. I mean, at this point, I could never do all the stories that have come my way through phone calls and email and
Right.
texts, you name it.
Okay, well, pass on a few to us. All right, let's go to questions. If we can have a show of hands. Also, please try to ask a question. Don't make a statement, and try and keep it brief. Yeah, can we go to the lady over there? In the red, I think. Put on my glasses. Losing eyesight.
Yeah. Aren't we all?
No? Do you want to try to? Yeah.
Sure.
Shout it out.
Hi.
Has anyone ever told you that you look a lot like George Stephanopoulos? And my real question number 2 is that you said that a journalist's job is to challenge the authority or question the authority, but I also believe that an annexation of that job is to see what changed after you did your reporting. So what exactly was the impact of the investigative reporting that you did, basically meaning what changed with the church and what happened thereafter? Thank you.
Well, that second question is really important. I mean, as for George Stephanopoulos, well, thanks. But look, I think what motivates me is to make change. I want to write stories that make the world a better place. And that's what's happened with regard to the Catholic Church. I mean, the first thing that happened is 4 months after we started writing our stories, all the bishops in America got together and they produced a document called the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People. And it's an impressive document. I don't think all the bishops are following it, but nevertheless, the fact that this document exists and the bishops are pledged to follow what's in there, I think is great progress. For instance, it requires all bishops to report evidence of child sexual abuse to the authorities, which means to the police. And it prohibits any bishop from settling a claim of child sexual abuse with a confidentiality agreement. This used to be standard operating practice. When people would complain about child sexual abuse, there'd be a small payment made, no records filed anywhere, everything hushed up. That's not happening anymore, and I think that's terrific. But fundamentally, I think the most important consequence of our reporting is that literally tens of thousands of clergy abuse victims all over the world who previously were suffering in silence, ashamed of what had happened to them, in many cases believing that they were somehow to blame for what had happened to them. I mean, all of these folks have been able to step out of the darkness and into the light and say, hey, this happened to me and it wasn't my fault and it was wrong. And I think that's been the greatest effect of our work.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, really, the impact of that. Yes, anyone else? Yeah, over here.
Hello?
Someone's got the mic?
Yeah, here, I have the mic.
Oh, here, okay.
Yeah, so I attended the session. I had questions for both of you. The question is similar. The session says the hunt for the truth. So does it necessarily involve going against the authorities? I mean, your job ideally is to find out what the truth is, correct? So what if it's not always challenging the authority, is what my question is.
I just couldn't hear.
He was saying that, when one talks of the hunt for the truth, is it always going against the authorities?
Well, it usually is, yeah. Usually you're going up an institution like the Catholic Church, or, my colleagues on the Spotlight team recently produced a story about the biggest, most prestigious hospital in Boston, run by a company that is the largest employer in the state of Massachusetts. I mean, they had well-known surgeons who were conducting 2 or 3 operations at once without telling the patients. And some of these operations were not done correctly. I mean, in that case, we're going up the most prestigious medical institution in the city of Boston. So you're often, you're going up against power. I mean, that's what investigative reporters do. Yes, you're going up against power, and sometimes there's going to be blowback. I mean, very powerful people are going to call your editor, very powerful people are going to call the publisher and urge them to kill the story. That's going to happen.
I mean, just to add to that, he's right. I mean, if you were to look at just conventional journalism, that's not always adversarial to power. That's just reporting news as it's happening. But if you talk about investigative journalism, then obviously you have to uncover some kind of malfeasance where power is held to account. And authorities doesn't always mean government authorities. For instance, we did an in-depth report about the safety or the lack of safety of construction workers and how there's an epidemic of construction worker deaths at building sites across India. Now, the primary, in a sense, the guilty party there were these big construction companies that don't follow basic norms of safety. They don't provide harnesses, they don't provide lifts, and then they cover up those deaths. So that was uncovering a different kind of power. But essentially, yes, that's what ideally good investigative journalism should be doing. It should be speaking truth to power. Yeah, my gosh, so many hands. Okay, the guy with the baseball cap there.
Hi, my name's Kai. So my question is, if you were the director of Spotlight, is there anything you would have changed to make more accurate or less accurate?
No, I think Tom McCarthy, who is the director, is really kind of a genius. I think without him, this probably wouldn't have happened, and the movie would probably not be as authentic and accurate as it is. I think that's really what the genius of this movie is. I mean, you think about what usually makes a movie work. Well, usually there's a car chase, there's a shootout, there's some romance, and there's none of that in Spotlight. There's not a car chase, there's no shootouts, you never see a firearm, there's no sex at all, there's not even any nudity. And somehow this movie was very, very popular all over the world and got the Academy Awards for Best Screenplay and Best Picture. So the guy's a genius, and I wouldn't change a thing.
Not even give yourself 5 extra minutes on screen? Okay, yeah. Guy over there.
Right, so in the era of Trump, you're seeing more and more late-night comedians coming to the field of pseudo-journalism to a certain extent, specifically, John Oliver and Stephen Colbert. So would you say that investigative journalism helps them, and would you say that they're making a bigger impact, in fact, in front of the epidemic of fake news that we have?
Yeah, I think this is really an interesting development. What you don't see when you watch these programs is that they have hired staffs on their staff, really credible, talented investigative reporters. So, I mean, there's a lot of money in network television, and they have the resources to hire good reporters, and that's what's happening. I think it's a fascinating development, and I think these programs are having a tremendous amount of influence. I mean, specifically, I think young people are really getting their news from Jon Stewart and John Oliver and things like that. So I think it's a fascinating development. I haven't really fully analyzed it yet, but I think it's really interesting, and I think in effect they're doing some investigative reporting. My problem is that it always bleeds into opinion, and I like to keep investigative reporting separate from opinion. So that's my reservation about it.
Okay, let's see, who else? Yeah, the lady there with the, yes, you ma'am.
Hello everyone. My question is that investigative journalism is important in breaking important stories, but nowadays news organizations are misusing it just to get some glory or business. So if you could just comment on that.
I'm not sure what you're saying. You're saying that some news organizations say they're doing investigative reporting, but it's really sensationalism or something? Yeah. Well, as I said, I think it's very important for news organizations to just be accurate, discover the truth, and report the truth without fear or favor. And I think attempts to sensationalize the news, I think they're unnecessary. I mean, if you're really going to do investigative reporting, who needs to sensationalize clergy sexual abuse? It's such an outrage. Who needs to sensationalize the plight of construction workers who are hurt or killed because no one's enforcing regulations? Who has to sensationalize that? It's a complete outrage, and I think it would affect readers and viewers very deeply.
Okay, let's see. Let's try to go a little bit at the back. Yeah, the guy with the orange shirt there.
Hi, Mr. Rezendes. So there's a new trend which is coming up in the media, which is known as post-truth, where personal narratives are being pushed, and by the time the real facts come out, idea has already spread to a nation. So do you think that this trend which is coming into journalism is a healthy trend, and is it good for a democracy or bad for a democracy?
You want to explain that for me a little bit slower?
So there's a new term which has come in, which is called post-truth journalism.
What is it called?
Post-truth.
Oh, he's talking about post-truth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So in that trend, like by the time the entire facts are out to the people, a certain opinion or an idea is pushed to the people and it's publicized. And by the time the real facts get out, there's already an opinion formed about a subject. So is that trend which is starting now good for a democracy or bad for a democracy?
Well, it's terrible for democracy. It's just absolutely terrible because what you're describing is a distortion of the truth. You know, there is no truth. There is no post-truth. There is only truth. There are only facts. I mean, truth exists. Post-truth does not. Post-truth is opinion at best. And at worst, it's a destructive, intentionally destructive distortion. So I don't think it's good for democracy at all.
Okie dokie. Let's go all the way back. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. My name's Indira, and my question to you is, you were talking about the fact that your investigations, especially like the one with the Catholic Church, took about 5 months, and some investigations go on for a year or even like many years for that matter. But in today's age, when a lot of digital media, houses are kind of trying to break such stories, I feel that there is a lot of our need to kind of get a story out and be the first to break a story is sort of overshadowing the fact that we need to do better investigation and to bring that story out. So how do we reconcile with that, and how do digital media houses, news media houses, break stories in the way that newspapers do it, the old school way?
Well, there's always a tension, and it can be a healthy tension, between getting a story out as quickly as possible and waiting till the story is done and that you've gotten all the way to the bottom of what you're investigating. There's always this tension. And you know, there are always editors who hear what I'm working on, and their first question is, well, when are we going to have it? You know, when can we have it? And I'm lucky to have a very good editor who essentially says, well, you can have it when it's done. You know, there is a lot of pressure to push stuff out early because partly it's the nature of the news business and partly it's because resources are tighter than ever. But I do think as an investigative reporter, it is important to not goof off or anything, but just work as hard as you can to get the full story, but to not publish until you've got it all. Sometimes there's what I call a rolling investigation, where maybe you've got a story that's just really hot, and you know you've only got a piece of it. And sometimes you make the decision, well, I'm going to publish what I have. And maybe when I publish what I have, other people who know about this will come forward and give me more information so I can publish another story.
Right.
That is another way to do an investigation. As I put it, you shake the tree and something falls out. I did an investigation, as I said before, of a state hospital that housed people who were mentally ill, and some people died there needlessly. And that was a rolling investigation. I think I wrote 30 page one stories about this one prison. And every story had new information. Every story took it deeper. So, that's two ways to do it. One is you just keep investigating till you think you have your arms around the whole thing, and then you come out with a 3-part series or a 4-part series. And the other way, as I said, is to just get what you got, put it out there, and see what develops.
I'm getting serious professional envy listening to you. Okay, I'm told we have time for literally one more question, so whoever can grab the mic, just go for it. No, I'm just kidding. Someone, ma'am, why don't you decide? Because if there's someone who's been trying to ask for a long time.
Hi, Michael. I'm also a journalist based in UK, and I've done a bit of investigative work. I want to know, as a journalist, whether a line exists at the Boston Globe that you draw before publishing a story if it means it will stoke tensions or even result in loss of lives? Has it ever happened? Thank you.
Well, we make these decisions. I think it's important to not have. It would be very, very difficult to decide to publish a story knowing that it was going to endanger someone's life. I think we would not do that. But there are nuances to that situation. I mean, what happens if we publish a story and the source, our confidential source, gets fired? Would we publish in that case? Would we publish a story if we believe that it was going to harm someone in a way that was not as serious as death, but was going to do them financial harm or physical harm? Would we publish that story? And those are very, very difficult decisions. I mentioned my colleagues who wrote about the hospital where the top flight surgeons were doing more than one surgery at a time. And the hospital did discover that there was a top flight surgeon who was giving us information. And that surgeon was fired after the story came out. Now, this particular surgeon, I think, was reaching the end of his career, so I don't think his family suffered as a result. But it was unnerving to see this very powerful institution immediately fire the source once they discovered who it was. But would we publish a story that would get someone killed? It's hard for me to imagine that. Really hard.
Okay, guys, we're out of time. Mike Rezendes, that was fantastic. Big hand of applause.
Thanks everybody.
Everyone. Thanks.